And it was really about spiritual progress. It wasn't about fixing symptoms or doing a workshop. This was for people who really were desperate for spiritual progress, really, who wanted God or bust, I would say. That's the kind of people he drew towards him, because he was quite serious and emanated realization. I mean, I don't know how you can quantify that or qualify it, but it was something I knew when I found it. You know, something hit me as like, oh, I want that.
What's up, everyone? Welcome back to the Above the Veil podcast. My name is Ryan Brown, and today we have Dani Antman with us. Dani, thank you so much for being here.
Hey, nice to be here.
Yes, I read your book, and it was absolutely incredible. It was, gosh, you've had a lot of experience packed in one life. It was mystical experience after mystical experience, so I could not recommend it enough. It was called Wired for God: Adventures of a Jewish Yogi. So yeah, you were able to explain a lot in that. And so today we were going to be going over spiritual teachers, essentially, for people to understand what it could be offered, some good of it, the bad of it, but also being able to see how it relates and see how it can help. And so, yeah, for yourself, it looked like the first teacher was Barbara Brennan. Was that kind of the first experience? Yeah. So going through her schooling, hearing of her, I know she's fairly talented psychic, able to see auras, energy blockages, you know. How was that experience overall, being able to go through the Barbara Brennan school?
Yeah, you know, I was in my early 30s at the time, and I had never done anything like a healing training. I was an artist at the time, and had never really done any personal growth work. So when I met Barbara Brennan, it was total magic at the time. And I say that also in quotes because I was very attracted to magic, as many people are. But it really was magic because she could see into people's behind the veil, as one would say, behind the veneer of, you know, the physical. She could tell what was going on in your childhood, in your psyche, in your body. So that was the magical part. And the training part was to open up your sensing mechanism and open up your own constrictions and blocks energetically, so that you too were open enough to perceive different levels of reality, subtle levels of reality. And honestly, I had no idea what I was getting into because I hadn't done that kind of work before. I didn't have a context for it. And I wasn't aware that I had anything to heal. And that was a rather rude shock. Of course I did.
Really? So you just joined out of interest initially?
Because I was attracted to the magic in a certain sense. I didn't
figure out what's going on, right?
Yeah, I didn't really know that I was going to have to do inner work. So,
yeah, much to our surprise. And then
when that opened up, I kind of got hooked on that because it was really finding where the truth was within you, within your own emotions, your own beliefs, where they came from, your own behaviors, like examining why you were a certain way. What was your own personal conditioning that influenced how you act and react in the world and in relationships? So it opened up a completely new world for me. I wouldn't have called it a spiritual training, although it kind of bumped against spirituality in a certain sense, and it piqued my interest in spirituality. But for instance, Barbara Brennan didn't present herself as a guru or having ultimate truth. But at the same time, in a way, it was the start of my spiritual path because it's self-inquiry, right?
Yeah, no, it served well. I know it. Reading the story, it seems to just get you really familiar with the subtle body and associating more with the energy levels and frequencies. And from there, it kind of opens up your awareness towards spirituality in general. So
in general, yeah. And also, to Barbara Brennan's credit, we were required to be in therapy. And we were introduced to psychological principles such as transference and countertransference, which is really important if you are going to work as a healer, to understand that people will transfer their feelings onto you in the healer-client relationship. And
Right.
that also happens in the spiritual world, where we transfer our feelings onto a spiritual teacher.
Yes, I took a lot of notes from reading your book, and that was actually one of the quotes that stuck out to me the most regarding healing. You said, "We attract the same patterns in relationship over and over again until we can recognize and heal the roots of our basic unmet needs. It takes courage to look within ourselves and transmute these wounds. When we heal, it's as if the hall of mirrors keeps us searching for completion and others disappears. What is left is open awareness and clear relationship for ourselves."
That about summarizes the whole process.
There we go. Awesome. So that covers
That covers everything.
there we go.
But
Moving
it's
on.
really important because people come to spiritual teachers with a lot of unmet parental needs and unexamined parental needs. And what I mean by that is a need for unconditional love, or a need for a kind authority figure, or a need to be taken care of, or a need to give your power away to somebody above you, all these things, in addition to a very, very real and sacred spiritual longing, which is the need to have a relationship with the divine. And they're all mixed up in this one package of like adoration of a spiritual teacher. And sooner or later, if the teacher is human, there's a shadow side. And even the very, very, very advanced teachers still have a personality and still have some shadow. And if it's not apparent personally, or if they're not aware of it, it gets worked out on a community level. And I've heard of a lot of ashrams and spiritual organizations having a lot of organizational shadow stuff. Anything in the area of money, or not paid employees, or too much seva, where the people are so exhausted that they're just working and not taking care of their own needs and their own self. It's actually rampant in spiritual community. So these things have yet to have a guiding force. It's very much up right now in spiritual communities that there's no guiding principles for spiritual teachers. A psychotherapist has to get licensed. And then there's a board of ethics and there's ethical guidelines. Spiritual teachers don't have that.
Right. Yeah. So this is what's really important, right? Because we hear in the news a lot of these circumstances where there's misleadings going on, sexual activity, and not doing what's best for the student in the end, because at the end of the day, they are still human and we have our flaws. And so when it comes to spirituality, we're very vulnerable, right? And
very vulnerable.
Yeah.
And I know you read in my book that early on, I had a very seductive spiritual teacher who I called Sananda in the book. I haven't heard or talked to him in years, but I was seduced by him eventually. And I found out he was a serial seducer of women in all his groups. And again, he had a lot of talents. He had a lot of energetic talent. He could be very kind. He wasn't all bad. It would be easy to vilify him. And I would have to say I was also very vulnerable, being in a very unhappy, not a very unhappy marriage, but a marriage that wasn't working very well. I mean, I wasn't abused. It wasn't that bad, but it wasn't working. And he preyed on women who were vulnerable, basically. And I've seen this pattern over and over again with other women, because people come to me now that I've written about it. But I can't say it was all his fault, because I hadn't done my work that contributed to it. And at the same time, he was abusing his energetic and very, very prodigious, seductive energetic powers, I would say.
Yes.
What I mean by that, to be really specific, because I've heard this a lot, is that he energetically seduced, which means he would come to me energetically and like fill my field with very delicious energy, but it was addicting. And I associated it with him and with being special and love, and it's very, very seductive. And I have heard of other women, mainly women, not too many men actually, but mainly women being seduced by other teachers in the same way, where there's kind of an energetic boundary invasion and a merging. And it's very hard to disconnect from that. It actually takes you over to some degree.
Yeah. On the surface, you'd think it's just a power dynamic and of course attraction to such a great teacher, but you gave tangible sense for this in your book. You talked about in the astral plane while you're sleeping, how who you characterized as Sananda was able to influence that exact intention that he had sexually. So yeah, this would be important for people because these instances unfortunately cast a bad label for all teachers and gurus who might not be this way. So, in your experience, what are some ways, since it's not regulated, to be able to assess what is best, especially when looking for a teacher for trauma work? Should the student get to know the philosophy themselves first, understand a certain amount before, and then look for certain teachers within that own sense? Or, is there certain questions to ask? What would you say?
There's a lot of standards, I think. First of all, there's now an Association for Spiritual Integrity, and it's ASI, I think Association for Spiritual Integrity.org, I'm pretty sure. It's also on Facebook. And it was started by Rick Archer of Buddha at the Gas Pump Community, because he gets wind of a lot of these teachers and has interviewed some of them that have had problems. So there's a whole list of ethics, which is a start. It's not standardized, but they actually made a list of ethics for students and teachers, and it's really good. So,
what was this called again?
Association for Spiritual Integrity.
Okay, I didn't know that, but
yeah, you can Google that. There's the age-old adage of looking at the fruit of the teacher, seeing those that are close to the teacher. Are they evolving? Have they been able to individuate? Or are they stuck in a childlike position to the teacher? Are you allowed to ask questions, or is it the master's word only? Do you have to follow blindly? Those are big red alarms.
Right, for sure. No, that's good, because I know with really high beings, you can't always know the extent of it, because as we saw in the rest of your story, we'll get to your experience with Swamiji. He's able to see all your previous sanskars, lives, where you are in a moment. So he might see if you're coming from a place of pride and really needing to hammer that down, versus other might be seeing that from the outside, thinking like, whoa, like this guy's aggressive, like does not seem like the humble guru type, probably not for me. And in reality,
I think it can be really confusing. I think it can be really confusing. And there's a certain cultural thing with Indian teachers that's very cultural, actually. And you translate that to the West, and somebody who's been abused will not be able to tell the difference between a teacher kind of being harsh because it's good for you, or harsh because they're being abusive. If you have trauma and abuse in your own life, trauma sometimes attracts trauma. It's just the energetic nature of it. And B, it's hard to have discernment until you've cleared your own trauma. And that's a whole ball of wax in and of itself, right?
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, some of it, in hindsight, I think there's a place where we all know the truth almost immediately. And then we get blinded by our needs and wanting to have approval or validation, or give our power away to some higher authority. And then, the benefits of having a teacher, which we didn't talk about at all, is that you can be guided in a really good way through practices that are very helpful.
Oh yeah, we were going to get to that, because it was pretty extraordinary what you were able to experience from the teachers to come. So before getting to Swamiji, that's where things started to really progress quickly for your spiritual journey.
Yeah.
To that point, I think that's a good question, because first off, on that note, from spiritual teachings, I think it is important not to have blind faith. It's really important for yourself to see if it's logical and practical. And
is there proof in the pudding? Is there proof in the pudding?
Yes, shouldn't be blind faith if it's actually making a difference. And to that point you made before with, we get our own needs in the way question for that is, do you think that we need to heal ourselves enough in a way before we can really take on a spiritual practice or path? Or do you think it can come up later?
I think we have to invite our personal healing as part of the spiritual path at all times, really.
Yeah.
It's never too soon to start personal work. And a lot of the young kids coming in today that I speak to, the 19 and 20-year-olds, are already kind of in. It took me till I was 30 to even want to do spiritual work. But the younger generation is coming in a lot more open and curious. And they're also having awakenings and having these same questions. So I feel that that's why this is really important. What people do need to know that meditation is going to open up the stuck and stored frozen places or blocks emotionally and physically and belief-wise. It will eventually open it all up. It's geared to do that. And I just think we need companions along the way that are very grounded and have walked the path already and know the importance and value of integration of these levels. So I get people who come to me that went on one Vipassana retreat and completely freaked out because they had trauma and they couldn't sit still without the trauma coming up. So that's why I feel it's really important. And then when you're looking at the teacher, do they emanate kindness and integration? Can they be humble in talking about their own process? Like, they struggled with this, they're still working on this, or they reach out to help when they need it. Is there a lineage holding them where they're guided by a real lineage? They don't have to all be in body, but a real lineage means it has a history.
Yeah, no, those things are important because they're all intermixed. And so from your experience, you went through quite a bit of healing, but as we saw, it always continues on. But you looked to appear to really start your spiritual path when meeting Jason, who I know ended up teaching Kabbalah. Right. And so touching on that quickly, I know we won't be able to go into the depths of Kabbalism. There's a lot to it that's interesting. But yeah, I didn't realize Kabbalah, for those that don't know, it's a mystical side of Judaism. I had no idea that it could be actually used for healing. So if you could just touch on...
That was Jason Shulman, the founders. That was his invention, and it works quite well. It was his kind of revelation, actually. He was meditating and thinking about teaching, and it came to him. And it actually works really well. It's part of the work that I do. But one of the reasons I was drawn to Jason, he was a student at Barbara Brennan's, I think, when I met him, and then later went on to create this whole teaching. But he always seemed to embody both the longing and the knowing of God, with quotes, whatever we think of God as God. And he had a background in some Eastern traditions like Zen and yoga. And yet he went back to his own Jewish tradition to search for the real mystical awakening truths. So I found that very, very appealing because I knew nothing about my own Jewish tradition, having grown up Jewish, right? And I think it was his own kind of longing for God that attracted me and kind of awakened my own longing on a spiritual path, which was very sweet.
I actually wrote that down because I thought that was a good indicator for after just having the experience you had with Sananda to then be willing. So many will stop there and just look to themselves moving forward, which is also okay. But you were willing to, you were still underneath the healing, had a sense of longing. And you wrote that was willing to essentially have Jason as a teacher since you put in quotes, he was married, wasn't seductive, and seemed to know how to know God, which spoke to the deep longing in my heart to be on a spiritual path. So I think that speaks a lot to knowing which path could be the right one to at least try or take on for oneself. So,
and the other thing I think was that the internal growth kept opening through the qualities of the tree of life, that we learned how to use those qualities as a lens through which to look at our own inner growth. Continued there, it just continued.
Yeah, well, real quick on that, I'll put a photo of the Tree of Life and people could follow because I was following along with how you're describing your book. And so the Tree of Life are 10 sephiras. Am I pronouncing that correct?
Spherot in plural.
Okay, there we go. So
Yeah.
10 Sephirot, and then so there's 10 of them, and there's essentially kind of the
Top to
pinnacle,
bottom.
right, which is kind of the sense of liberation, and the bottom, Makuth, I believe,
Yeah.
is a sense
The
of kind of,
earth.
yeah, the earth planet kind of, yeah, manifestation aspect versus liberation aspect. So yeah, I didn't realize they overlapped somewhat with the different separates of the body. And if you could speak on that real quick, how each on the polarities that it speaks about
Mm-hmm.
in the body.
There's a lot of comparisons, of course, to the chakra system, but they're rooted differently culturally. But you could say that the tree of life represents both creation manifesting from the one down, like you said, to the earth plane, but also our journey back to the one, like from our physical incarnation, how do we awaken and open to the spirit? And it's set up with complementary pairs of qualities around a central column. And as you work these complementary pairs, you find yourself being able to embody more of reality and stay centered and balanced and have more ability to not be pulled side to side in life. And, as I've watched the political atmosphere in the United States, I thought this would be really helpful for everybody in the United States to not get so polarized if they only understood how both sides exist within them instead of having this need to be so polarized right to left, which is very much apparent in our country right now.
Yeah, and it was showing so there's many pathways for that exact intent liberation. And so it was interesting. There's three main columns. One side seems to be more kind of free going, free spirit.
Outpouring.
And then the other side is very like logical, intellectually based, disciplined.
Bounded.
And then the middle is more balance between the two. So it appears though, is the intent to bring it more towards balance for the sense of liberation, or there are so many paths through the tree of life that could you be on one side, the either other columns and experience liberation as well, or go those routes in the sense?
I think it needs to balance.
Okay.
One of the words for an enlightened being in Hebrew is a tzaddik, the righteous one, literally, but also somebody who has learned how to embody equilibrium. And you would have to have that before, it would be a prerequisite before you open up to the realms of vastness, which in Kabbalah are above the tree of life. And there's 3 additional levels as you approach nothingness and vastness. But the prerequisite for even studying the tree, so the rabbis said, was this sense of equilibrium. And it means that you can hold more of reality without shattering in yourself. You're balanced.
Yes, no, that makes sense, because we see a lot in very psychic beings and spirituality, people looking for awakenings, how their crown chakra is very developed, but maybe not as equal in the 7.
And the lower sphere, right?
Right. Okay.
Right.
Awesome. Yeah. So there's a lot there that I think pertains to spirituality.
Do a whole class on the tree of life, which I may do at some point.
Yeah. No, it's super interesting. And so, yeah, now from here, there appears to be a big difference from when. So at this point, you were in Kabbalah school for 9 years with Jason, and you became.
I was teaching for most of them.
You became pretty high up teacher for yourself, right? And then from here, how do you make sense of? Because it seemed almost guided where you met Swamiji. So I don't know if you could speak on that.
I was praying for him. It was very guided.
Yeah.
And there was nothing intrinsically wrong at the time, but there was a voice within me that didn't feel quite authentic with my moving up the ladder in teaching. And I was about to take another leap in the school and take more responsibility. And at the same time, it's like there was a part of me that was needing to grow, and I couldn't figure out a way to do it with the duties that I had. And also, simultaneously, I was feeling really exhausted. And I just had this sense that I was on the edge of a big change, but I couldn't seem to leap myself. So I started to pray for guidance. And within 2 weeks of praying, I was invited to a lecture in New York City at the time about Kundalini. And honestly, it's not something I had thought about or studied before, but something said yes, like a big yes inside. And the lecture was given by a man who's since passed on named Swami Chandrasekharanand Saraswati. It's a big mouthful. Chandrasekharanand Saraswati.
Yeah.
And he was from Rishikesh, India, but had an American disciple from Tennessee with him named Joan Harrigan. And they were giving a lecture on Kundalini science, which was from a very small lineage, meaning no ashram, and handed down from one teacher to disciple. So there was no training of anyone other than one disciple at a time. And it was a lineage of Kundalini science where he was able to help people evaluate where their Kundalini was, and then very, very specifically discern how it was traveling in your body through 6 different possible channels or nadis, and then what needed to happen to help spiritual progress go further. And it was really about spiritual progress. It wasn't about fixing symptoms or doing a workshop. This was for people who really were desperate for spiritual progress, really, who wanted God or bust, I would say. That's the kind of people he drew towards him, because he was quite serious and emanated realization. I mean, I don't know how you can quantify that or qualify it, but it was something I knew when I found it. Something hit me as like, oh, I want that,
Yeah, God or bust. I love that. No, yeah. I think this is what's so important, is because in my experience too, I had to, surrender in a way and look for guidance essentially. And similarly, that's how I was able to find my teacher. And so that's why this quote caught my eye. And you specifically said, "Please God, show me the next step. Show me what to do next." I pleaded, "Please help me find a teacher who can help me." Surprisingly, my prayers were answered a lot sooner than I expected. And suddenly I found myself setting out on a new path. And so, yeah, and meeting Swamiji, again, very high being, could tell he was able to sense where you were in a way and exactly what was needed.
Actually, immediately. It's rather humbling, because the first thing he told me was that I was lost.
Refreshing.
Here I was going to become this big teacher, right? And you're lost.
No, that's too funny.
And actually, on a spiritual level, and with the things I was doing in my life, I was lost. Not maybe so obviously on the outside, but as I did practices, I stayed with his practices, which changed over the years. But I think it was 14 years of really guided practice, and then he died 2 years later.
Yeah, so this was just reading it through, because you had a lot of hands-on experience with him. I mean, he literally guided you step by step, exactly which practices would modify the practices, every visit you had with him, and counsel through, and right when you're ready for maybe the next step, that was being provided. So that's
just so you know, it sounds that way, but there would be like periods where you're just left to do the work. It would be like 6 months to 8 months between consultations. And I probably did 8 retreats where I got new practices over 14 years. So in between was the hard work of doing your practice. And the practices were yogic in style, but because I was Jewish, he modified them to give me Hebrew names of God at times, or certain Hebrew phrases. And I think that was his genius, that he really looked at the person's inclinations and lineage and helped you. Like if you were Jesus oriented, you would get Jesus in your practice somehow, somewhere or other. And he really helped you find your own lane, so to speak, and encouraged that, which is very unusual for an Indian teacher.
Yeah, you described how he overlapped it with the Tree of Life, and how the chakras were overlapping with different parts of the Tree of Life. So he studied
these traditions. He had books on the Tree of Life, And when I was in India with him, he sent me to a Shabbat dinner in Rishikesh and then wanted to meet the rabbi, which we did for tea.
It's too funny. Gosh.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. From there, I think this speaks to, I'd actually be curious on your take from it, because through your practice with Kundalini, it's very oriented towards the chakras and it's step-by-step process with a higher vibration, if you will. So do you relate that to a lot of New Age spirituality speaks of this, how the path is to simply raise your frequency? So is that a way you would look at the practice you were doing? It seems to be much more detailed, but I don't know if you would relate in that similar manner, or if it's more specific than that, than just
It was
raising.
more specific than raise the frequency, but certainly raising the frequency. I would say that one of the functions of a spiritual teacher is that they are at a higher vibration or frequency or depth of realization, might be a better way to put it. And that was really palpable with him, that when he walked into the room, it was like getting sometimes blasted with energy. I mean, for me, it was completely palpable, and it would stir up the process, I would say, stir up the process. The Kundalini is the divine within every human being. And when the sperm meets the egg at conception, you could say the God force of Kundalini or Shakti is embedded in the spine in every single human being, no matter what religion or what path you follow. And then all the different religious traditions have different names for it, like Holy Spirit or perhaps Shekinah, but they work with it in their own way. And it's been a lifelong, I don't know, inquiry for me to find out what kind of works in the Jewish tradition. And I didn't go that way. But in the Jewish tradition, and specifically for men, because women kind of weren't included too much in the practices, studying Torah, the 5 books of Moses, was a kind of contemplative way to go from the intellect to something way beneath that, which is the light of the Torah itself, the light and energy that's within those books that would then be the force of awakening. And the same with all the very strict and rule-oriented religious practices. They were like life, everyday practices with food, with behavior, with doing good, that were meant to be the foundation for awakening. Just like yamas and niyamas in yoga, the rules of ethical behavior. You would need to establish all of that before any of the mystical studies, right? I've done everything kind of backwards, but
You got there. That's all that matters.
yeah, I got there somehow. Did
Yeah.
did a lot of mistakes and things backwards, but I also believe I have a Jewish soul that had a lot of experience in previous lifetimes with some of those practices, both positive and negative. Yeah.
Yeah, we can transition to that. I do want to get back to this idea of specific practice and discipline versus not feeling confined and dogmatic. I think there's a fine line
There
that's
is, and
important
maybe
there.
a dance with that. But
Yeah.
anyway, back to frequency and practices. So Swamiji's lineage delineated very particular ways that practice can move the 5 pranas, which are called vayus, 5 vayus, which like are the channels, and these larger nadis, Kundalini, Shakti nadis, how to work with them with specific practices, which is unheard of really anywhere else. I've just never seen it anywhere else, and I've looked.
Now,
So
the
the
nadis are specific pathways for essentially
specific
liberation.
pathways, yeah. And they relate to the chakra system. And it was almost scientific and in application because it just worked. And they were simple yoga practices, but when combined a particular way, they provided enough heat in the body and force to move and help Kundalini progress upwards. And beyond that, I think the lineage itself aided the process. But honestly, I haven't seen anything like it anywhere. Earlier, you and I were talking about Yogi Bhajan, which is the name that comes up most often with Kundalini yoga and Kundalini practices. And he's since been proven to be kind of a fraud. That's currently happening right now. There's a lot of disclosure around that. But those practices were they were group practices, and these practices were very individual. And some of those group practices would be very harmful for some people, like me particularly, and they might be right for other people. But what was unusual is this was very individualistic, and it
That
was the
makes
only
sense.
way he would work.
Yes, because you specifically had a Vajra nadi that you were
I
on.
had a Vajra rising, which is a nadi,
Right.
and it had no access to the main central channel until it was caused through the practices to go actually down and then come back up through the main channel. And that was something I'd never heard of before and specific to this skill of this lineage. To even name it, notice it, and then be able to correct it. And it was as real as anything I've ever experienced. The actual experience of that deflection coming into the center was really real. So I know it wasn't an imaginary thing. You know what I mean? Yeah.
Yeah, that's why I think it depends on the intention, right? There could be a spiritual sattvic life if you describe it to where raising frequency, and there's general things that could be done that make a big influence in general. But if the goal is liberating and not coming back around, if you will, for the cycle of birth and rebirth, then it appears a specific practice is very much needed to fulfill that.
Yeah.
But it's intense.
I just want to say, because I get a lot of calls about this, is that I'm not qualified to give those practices. And there's only one person, the now current lineage holder, and it's a woman who lives in Austria and sometimes Rishikesh, India. Her name is Sylvia Eberl, and you can include a link to her later. But Swamiji passed in 2016, and Joan Harrigan is retired. So there's really only one person doing that particular work. And I get a lot of calls from people who have kind of disturbing Kundalini symptoms. And it's usually because it's rising through one of two deflected channels, or it's stuck because of previous traumas, or just hasn't had the right conditions to continue its journey peacefully.
Yes, and yeah, the last part on this experience with Kundalini and Swamiji is that purification process,
Mm-hmm.
because a big theme of this is releasing karma that we've talked about, how our karmas, our sand scars are carried in our mind, and essentially a purification process for us to be able to connect with the divine.
Yeah,
So yeah, if you could speak on that at all, because I know you had a lot of
yeah,
ups and downs for this process, essentially shedding a lot of
yeah.
those sand scars.
Yeah, there's a kind of misinformation, mainly coming from the Neo Advaita people, that there's no purification process, that you just realize that who you are that, and that's it, right? No purification process needed. And it ignores the subtle body and all those things that are held in our energy body, physical body, and subtle body. And that's one of my pet peeves. So
Yeah.
as you start to awaken, all these things that are long held in your history, whether it's past life or current, are going to come up for healing. And Kundalini acts as the great healer. She's trying to heal you, but sometimes some disturbing and uncomfortable symptoms come up because it's working through your energy body, your subtle body. And all sorts of things like weird body movements, headaches, pressure in the head. Could be a lot of light, but you can't handle the light yet. You know, it's overwhelming light, or you can't function in the world. All these things I hear about from people. They need time and care and rest, and sometimes really good guidance. And the purification process gets subtler and subtler. Like first all this big stuff comes up, and then there's a lot of subtle stuff that comes up through relationships in your life, or through illness or dietary changes. I mean, it gets subtler and subtler, but it's all meant to clear you out so that you can be a good vehicle for your awakening, that you have the physical and energetic vehicle to embody your awakening.
That is a good way to put it. And so, yeah, because we hear a lot, especially in the West, we gravitate towards the idea, well, I am God, right? I am a soul, so I'm a divine. So all I need is all the answers are from within. And that's true in a sense, in the pure sense of what a soul is, but we have the separateness from it due to the mind and the karmas and the samskars. And so being able to go through that purification process to actually feel that way. And normally guidance is needed. And that's why part of the book I thought was extraordinary. And also the side note from it, this was on a day where you mentioned how you just were going through this shedding process and you just felt like old worn baggage, like you were just shedding things away and just felt lethargic, tired, like didn't want to go through anything. And people voice these symptoms a lot during their awakening. And I see it as such a good thing because that means they're letting go of these things, getting closer. And during that moment, that's when, being guided by Swamiji in this moment, you were going through the practices he was observing, and you were going through Kundalini movement of some sort. And he immediately told you to lie down, and you lie down. And what was amazing is you had this all experiencing this breakthrough on the day where you felt, on your worst, or with all the symptoms you mentioned before. So yeah.
And it also speaks to a more subtle experience of dark night of the soul that people have, where even after an initial awakening, some people get really depressed because it feels like nothing's happening and they're just surrounded by all their baggage, basically, and darker. And, you have to have guidance there to be able to work through your stuff layer by layer so that you can see that light and have that opening again. It's, the darkness precedes the light very often.
Yeah. So from there to bring your story to a head here, I know you had quite a few more of those awakenings that occur for yourself in a sense of homecoming even. And so the transition into that, this was the quote that stood out to me, where this was emotional moment that spoke to Swamiji's guidance, but you said, you slid down the wall to the floor. Swamiji, please help me. I don't want to keep making the same mistakes lifetime after lifetime. These words, neither logical nor premeditated, poured out from the depths of my soul, and Swamiji never let me forget them. In that moment, time stood still. I sensed Swamiji seeing through me, seeing the bag of traumas I had carried for lifetimes. He said, you have had a tragic fall from grace in a past life. You were exiled from the Jewish tribe and allowed to die. That's the past. And Kundalini will heal you. You need to forgive and forget.
Rather dramatic, eh?
Yeah, I would say so. But I thought that was intriguing to see how there's a reasoning for what we're going through. And yeah.
But there's themes to each person's life. And sometimes you don't even know what your theme is until someone says it for you. And the power to that type of seeing is it was so exact that something inside me cracked open. Like when the theme was named, it's almost like all these other fragments that you wouldn't pay attention to in your life, they got very coalesced, and I got to see and reflect upon a lot of things in my life. And it didn't heal right away. I would say that part of the healing is me working with the Kabbalah, because it feels like something I knew a long time ago that I was then estranged from and ostracized almost from. So the work of teaching it and working with it is like my reunion with it in a time where I'm accepted as a woman even. So there's some things that have a kind of such a profound grip on us. And that's how I understand the vasanas and samskaras, that they're such deeply held themes that they carry from lifetime to lifetime, and they grip you, and you don't even know why sometimes. And when you can see it and name it, at least it gives you a context for why you're doing what you're doing, or the work you're doing, in the world.
It's assuring when you get to at least know why, and it's not so much self-blame and understanding the root of it. So Yeah, if you could describe this sense of homecoming you felt, because I think this really pertains to people, how we all have our own path for home in a sense. It
It's
seemed to.
since happened twice in my life and hasn't happened since because I guess you don't need it to. But it was a sense of being surrounded by guides of the Jewish lineage for me and having their love and acceptance and being witnessed by them and being invited back into the fold, so to speak. I didn't even know I had a lot of anger towards Judaism and the views within Judaism until I was accepted back. It was like something melted in me, like the barriers to studying Kabbalah and the barriers to the religion in my heart melted. So much so that when I came to California and I was in my mid-50s, I got bat mitzvahed, which I would have normally done at age 13, but I didn't want it at 13. I kind of wanted nothing to do with it. And it was extremely meaningful to do it at 56, middle-aged woman, learning how to pronounce the words of the Torah and read in front of my friends and relatives in Hebrew. It was very, very moving. You know, it's such a beautiful thing to do when you can appreciate it, not when your parents are forcing you to do it because you have to, because you're 13 years old.
Yeah, I too got my bar mitzvah 13 to make sure my grandfather was happy. I think I showed up to the rabbi's door like 2 weeks beforehand to say, what do I have to do? And did not know Hebrew. I got kicked out of Hebrew school when I was young. So I read something in English and they gave me the nod to be
really?
wasn't as traditional, but
you know, it's a living tradition. And yeah. I think with today's times, you can approach this tradition in many different ways. There's like Jubus and Hindus and all sorts of things. But there's also an expression, once a Jew, always a Jew. There's something that lives inside you that doesn't get extinguished, and we can just call it light, basically.
Better than Jewish guilt, that's what I thought it would be.
No, it can be expressed in many different ways, but there's a light within. Of course, there's a light within everybody, but there's a certain kind of flavor that just seems to be a soul thing. And I'm sure it's true for Hindus and Christians that there's something in the heart that knows its lineage, and that's the homecoming feeling, to sum that up.
Yeah. Well, I think that speaks to the experience of past lives we've gone through. So
you can feel that in India, being Jewish, right? You can feel like you land in India and you've had your homecoming because your soul is remembering that.
Oh, yeah. No, that's powerful. And so, yeah, I'm just curious where you find that with yourself now. Do you have a sense of that presence? Do you relate it to a sense of like spirit guides, almost ancestors? Because we actually just had a previous episode on spirit guides. So I was just curious on that. I was curious on that relationship, if that's how you would designate it.
There's a level of guidance that comes from this Jewish lineage that doesn't feel like the ordinary kind of guide. Like I work with healing guides and they're very active and they work through my hands. I don't even know who they are, but I would call them Jewish or Hindu or anything. They're my healing guides, right? This level of homecoming felt, I don't know, I would call them serious dudes of a high frequency.
Serious high frequency dudes, all right.
Yeah, I don't know. They felt like very high beings that I don't see very often. I've seen them maybe 3 times they've come. And yet I know they're there guiding me. So I don't know what that means. I'd like to know more about what that means. Swamiji even told me that they come to me, I can't go to them. That wait for them to come to you.
But hearing your story, I mean, I think the biggest thing is people could take away from it, you know, the saying goes, once the student is ready, the teacher appears. And when we're ready, these instances happen. It appears very clear that you were guided in a sense to be able to be where you are now. I mean, to go from Barbara Brennan healing school to then the sciences of Vedic Kundalini and Kabbalah to then now finding your Jewish ancestors. And yeah, so as far as just how you feel now, if at all, you know, just the reassurance after going through it all, because I know you went through a lot of with death being a teacher as well, where all these teachers that you knew essentially passed. And so,
Yeah, my parents died and friends died.
yes.
And,
So
yeah,
that's, as far as the purification process goes, that can be very difficult. So yeah, just letting people know kind of where this all finds you after going through the circuitous route of all these teachings and teachers.
people have asked me that, and like, when are you going to write the next book? And I laugh because things have gotten extremely quiet and very ordinary and peaceful. And I feel like I'm on track in many ways. I am 65 now, so it's like hard-won peacefulness and settledness. And the inner work continues in a very, very subtle way. It feels more that I just need the time and have to provide the time to sink into samadhi or to sink into the oneness and allow that to keep permeating and illuminating whatever else needs to come forth, really. And when I work with people, I'm working from presence and emptiness more than technique at this point. It's not that I don't do the things I've learned, but it's coming from a place of emptiness, more or less, and deep listening and presence. So it's not about fixing, it's about being with and recognizing and seeing. So it feels different from the early Barbara Brennan days, which were all about these amazing techniques we were learning. But I'm not really doing a lot of techniques, but things heal and things open. It's interesting. It comes from presence and integration.
Well, to end here, I thought I would use a quote here I thought that really speaks to guidance you received. You said, guidance is subtle, not in words. Rather, they seed important concepts that eventually filter down to my daily reality. I feel them overseeing things from a distance, especially as I write this book. Who am I to have this connection? I don't know. All I do know is that longing for God is a holy longing. It is the ultimate longing, and this longing is always seen and acknowledged by the adepts who have helped humankind evolve. Each spiritual path has spiritual adepts who oversee these lineage, and when our longing for God gets strong enough, they guide us step by step on our path through the channels of spirituality that are most familiar to our souls towards liberation. Even in the most circuitous paths lead home. So
Yeah.
I thought that was beautiful.
True. Thank you.
Right.
It is really true to remember that if your longing is true, it will lead you. And that goes even back to teachers. You'll be led, and then, you have to use your own discernment. You're led to a teacher, you experience the teachings, you'll know when to stay, when to leave, in the same way you were guided in the beginning. Things unfold naturally and organically.
Yeah, no, I think it speaks to a dark night of the soul that you mentioned before. That's where a lot of the impurities are being addressed, and that's where that point of longing and surrender comes, and things can be guided from there. So
It's nice to be interviewed by somebody who understands the language and the experience. So thank
yeah.
you for that.
So thank you so much for coming on. Your experience spoke so much to me with everything I was reading. It felt really relatable, but also just learned so much through the process of everything you've gone through. So yeah, if you're up for it, I even think a part 2 would be great. If you're not going to write the book, we can write the episode to address some of these other aspects I think are important. So
And
Dani, thank you.
I also do private sessions with people. I'm on Zoom mainly right now. And my website, maybe you could post it, is Dani, Dani Antman.com. And
Yes.
People can book online.
Yes, I want to make sure people could find you if they're interested. So particularly, what are the services for healing or for spiritual?
Healing and spiritual counseling.
Okay.
And I'm also a local wedding officiant.
Hey, just throw that on the side, huh?
I marry people.
That's too funny. Okay. Well, just combine them both, right? Just
Yeah.
spiritual awakening and marriage. There you go. So awesome. All right. Well, as always, everyone, hope to find you on the other side of the veil in our next episode. Until then, stay well. Thank you, guys.
Hey, me again. If you did make it this far, I hope the information helped. In order to continue making content like this, it does rely on the support of listeners like yourself. So any support goes a really long way. There is a PayPal button in the description below. And yeah, it would just be such an honor to eventually do this full time. So thank you. And also feel free to join our community on Facebook, Other Side of the Veil, join other like-minded spiritual seekers and guests from before, where you can ask your own questions that you might have had. So yeah, hope to see you there. Thank you.